Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the topic of pay, which I'm sure is very close to all your hearts. We're very lucky to have with us tonight Nick Everard, who's Managing Director of J1 Consulting, who's going to talk to you about pay, what you should expect, how to negotiate it, and all those sort of issues. Okay, so first of all then, I'm just going to ask Nick. Nick, can you just introduce yourself? I'm sure some of the clients listening will already know you, but can you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your background?
Yes, certainly, Fiona. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Everard. I was an army officer for 22 years. I left a long time ago now, 1999. I had commanded the 9th 12th Lancers. I decided that was it for me, and I then left. I did 3 corporate jobs, 2 of them in a FTSE 100 company. One was a sort of head of relationship management for one of their divisions. One was a managing director of a company within that corporate. And then I did another job in a privately owned company as operations director for 4.5 years till we sold that company. And then I sort of started J1 Consulting with a partner in 2011. So we have been sourcing high-grade ex-military for client vacancies since then. So we've seen a fair bit of the offer and pay game. That's basically me in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. Well, I'm sure you're very well versed then to be able to help our clients with these tricky questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to then press on to the next thing. Okay, so I know you wanted to talk a little bit first of all about some of the things that people should consider before they start even thinking about pay. You know, what they want to earn, what they feel they should earn, and also maybe what their skills and experience will dictate that they are able to earn. So I'm just going to hand over to you on that one to make so that you can cover these points.
Okay. Pretty well self-explanatory, the slide. It's like any negotiation. You need to understand your own sort of territory before you start talking about what people might offer to you. And the first thing I would refer you to is the MOD benefits calculator. You can Google that, and that will give you a readout on your package as it is now. And it's well worth you understanding that and all the things that you get beyond the headline salary. Because, you know, if you don't understand that, then you're not in a good position to negotiate your next move. These 2 next websites, there are other ones out there, but these are 2 of the best. If you're going for an interview with a particular firm, the Job Crowd is a good place. Not everything's on it, but quite a few of the big corporates are, where you can get an informal view of what life's like there from the people who are currently working there. Now, what are the people like who go on these things? It's a bit like TripAdvisor, but you will get a view. You'll get some sort of internal, informal view. Glassdoor, there's quite a lot of common ground between these 2. But again, it should give you some sort of readout about what the salary norm is in some of these bigger corporates. So again, that's useful information if you're going in for, let's say, an operations director job. What's an operations job this particular company pay? There should be some sort of readout on that if it's an organization of any size. And as I say, there are other websites out there which do the same. Those are the 2 I happen to use the most.
So you're going to talk about sort of who are the players within the sort of the organisations, and you know, what do people need to be looking at when they think about that. So I'll just put these headings up and you can talk through them.
I suppose my main point is, you know, don't jump at the first thing offered and unless it ticks a lot of boxes, and not all of those are financial. A first point to realise it's a lot easier to move from a big corporate company to an SMA, small and medium-sized enterprise, or a startup than vice versa. So as a basic generic rule, and everybody's different, it's probably worth getting a recognised brand on your CV as the first civilian job you've got. But you know, as I say again, everybody's circumstances are different. But it is easier to make that move from big to small than from small to big. So I'll just make that point.
I mean, I would certainly agree with you from that one, and that's been my experience. Although the trouble is probably with some of our clients is that they geographically, if they've chosen to live in a certain location, then the big clients aren't always, you know, the employers aren't always there, and so they may have to make a choice of going with a small organisation or a not-for-profit organisation.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just about, then you've just got to do your due diligence, which comes on, you know, the bottom point there. You know, just do your research. Are they a credible organisation? Just have a look at some of the company reports. They're not difficult to read those. Is the thing profitable? Has it got a lot of debt? All those sort of issues are worth looking at. In terms of the second point, because it's sort of worth me mentioning this, a small company will generally make you either a high offer because they see you as key to success, or a low one if they're hiring you for potential. And that low offer probably needs some other features if it's going to be attractive. And one of those might be equity, a share in the business. That's the reason I moved from my corporate employer to my, you know, private employer.
Yeah.
But you're unlikely to get that straight out of the box in the military. You've probably got to establish a few commercial credentials first. So the corporates, the big corporates will in the middle, probably with a stronger supporting package and better training. So as I said earlier, they're basically the safer initial option as you're going through transition.
And do you think, Nick, is there any difference between different sectors? So, for example, you know, I work for John Lewis, so worked in retail. So, is there sort of a difference even amongst the corporates between who pays what?
Well, I think, you know, you're always going to get more in London. Some sectors are slightly higher paid than others. I think it's a slightly different point, but I think the thing to bear in mind is that, and it's what I mean by the third thing, know thyself. You're coming from the public sector with a big system, dare I say it, conventional mindset. And there's a sort of cliche out there, but nonetheless it's valid. Entrepreneurs are saboteurs. So can you become one of those? Or would you be happier as the corporate man or woman? You need to sort of work that out for yourself quite early on in your job hunt, I would suggest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one, because I think for some people leaving the military, it would be quite a sort of culture shock to go from a very large sort of structured hierarchical organisation to go to a sort of, you know, a small startup where there maybe is a very flat structure, you know, there's no hierarchy, that sort of thing.
Well, actually, I mean, we're off the subject here. I've just placed a guy into a company like that. All the directors are sort of under 30. They've got to a stage now where you can't just fly by the seat of your pants. They need a bit of organisation, and they've got somewhere in there now, mid-40s, staff officer type, bit of process. He's loving it, actually. So,
brilliant. So that works as well, then.
It works. Yeah, it does work, but as I say, horses for courses.
Okay. What about the practical realities then, Nick?
Well, what I meant there was just, and I've only seen this happen once. I mean, a guy took a job with a West Coast US employer. It paid well, but he was perpetually having conference calls at 11 at night. And so just consider those sort of issues. And again, it's on a sort of slightly smaller scale. How many nights are you going to be away from home? Do the realities of life as to how that's going to work for you? Is the commute feasible? All that sort of stuff. Don't be just seduced by a headline salary. You've got to actually live this life, and it's worth you thinking that through, discussing it with your better half, all those sort of things before you sign on the dotted line.
I think that's a really good point, because actually I see quite a lot of clients who say the reason they're leaving the military is because they want sort of more security or stability, and they don't want to be away from home and things like that. But actually, but they also want the punchy salaries. But sometimes you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's very much so, and that's almost the point I'm making at the bottom. With the death of the 9-to-5 job, of course, the 9-to-5 job is still there, and it'll still be with us for quite a long time. But if you're ambitious and then you've got to expect, I think, a degree of personal mobility, mobile working, be contactable out of hours, possibly working away from home. So again, temper your ambition. Are you that ambitious, or are you happy for a slightly less demanding regular 9-to-5 job?
Yeah. Yeah. And what about then the point you made about growth prospects, culture, and job satisfaction? What do you mean by all of that?
Well, I think you know, when you go into any job, you don't want to. There's got to be some career progression in it, depending on what stage of your career you enter the workplace, of course. So where's it going to lead to? And I think a point to make here, slightly off the point, is a lot of these corporates, there's stuff with so-called talent managers, but they don't actually do much. And in fact, a lot of what you'll do within your next job is actually network your way into the next stage. But is there a next stage in that particular role? And sometimes in the smaller companies, there isn't. That's it. There is no. It's dead man's shoes. So you've got to be careful about that, and see that there is some genuine career advancement. The culture. I like, before we take a job from somebody or get a job from somebody, I like to go and visit them. It might only be for an hour or so, but you get a feel for what sort of outfit they are and what sort of personality will fit in there. And you'll get a feel from that if you go for an interview. And, you know, dare I say it, some of the hard driving American-owned investment banks are not, in my view, an amenable work environment. But that's, again, it may well be for somebody else. And job satisfaction, I mean, you know, nobody's going to be happy doing a job that doesn't stimulate them to some degree. That's the same as it's always been in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, whatever rank you come from. Just don't sign up for something which you think, oh, I need a job, so I'll take this extremely boring, very mundane role. There's got to be an element of job satisfaction in it.
I think that's an important point, because I also, you know, have a discussion with clients about, are you looking for a job or are you looking for a career? And are you looking for, you know, just to tick the box to say I've got a job, or actually you're joining an organisation which gives you opportunities for growth and development, and therefore increasing your pay as you go on?
Well, that comes back almost to the small and medium enterprise and the big corporate. Because the big corporate, you can go up the bureaucracy. The small and medium enterprise, it might grow very fast, and therefore your job could just expand exponentially. But it might not. It might crash and burn. So again, I don't say never sign up to an SMB. I think some people have done extremely well doing that, but just be careful that you think it's got genuine prospects before you do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, because I've had experience of working both for a large corporate like John Lewis and a you know, a small startup company, which was great at the beginning, but because of the financial crash, and I was the HR manager and cost of the business, therefore I went, you know. And you have to be able to take that risk, don't you? That if you go to an SME, if things go well, you might do extremely well yourself, but if things don't go well, you could be quite vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, even in the big corporates, they chop whole departments. And I've had, you know, a few people saying, oh, what did I do wrong? Well, the short answer, you did nothing wrong. It's just called capitalism. And sometimes there are casualties of that, and it's not your fault. And in fact, most people at some stage in their careers will probably go through something like that. It's not the public sector. There is occasionally blood on the carpet. You know, and that's life. That's what you're moving into.
And I think it is, as you say, it's just something you have to accept with corporate life. What about the, you were saying instant offers and due diligence. What did you mean by that?
Well, essentially what I meant is, you know, don't accept jobs offered after an hour, particularly from friends. And it does happen, you know, third pint in the pub. You've known Jimmy since we were at university. Why don't you join us? If you're going to do that, and some people get good jobs that way, there's nothing wrong with that, provided you don't skimp on the legalities and you do your due diligence. So, you know, not everybody is an officer and a gentleman when the chips are down financially. So all I'm saying is, great, if you get an instant offer, that's fantastic. But don't accept on the fourth pint. Just go and do your homework before you take that up.
I think that's a really good point about that, and doing your due diligence, and don't just taking something at face value. We've covered the 9-to-5 jobs, unless the death of the 9-to-5 job, unless there was anything else that you wanted on that one.
No, I don't think so. I made that point. It's just it's an ambition point, really, and you know, more and more that's it.
Yeah. And I think these days with technology, I mean, it is more and more people are not doing a 9-to-5 job, and they are contactable sort of wherever they are, which could be a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the modern world. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
pay. Okay, let's just go on to the next slide and talking about what do people need to consider when they're sort of before they get into the negotiation stage of pay.
Well, I mean, it's quite a common aspiration as people come out of the military. I hear this quite often that I want to, inverted commas, match what I get now, and that's a pretty fair rule of thumb. But I would just make the following points. Firstly, the MOD paid you whatever it did. Let's say it was 60K after X years of training and experience. So why should anybody pay you X plus 10 grand on day one when you're completely new to their sector and you represent a risk to them? So I would say on that point, don't price yourself out of a good opportunity. I've seen people do that inadvertently because they just think the private sector pays more than the public sector. Well, it can do, but you're trying to transition. So, just don't price yourself out. And I think the other thing to the like-for-like point is you're not comparing apples with apples if you take that simplistic viewpoint, because there's no bonus element in the public sector salary. It's much more normally base plus an incentive or a bonus scheme. And the question is, are your on-target earnings likely to be comparable rather than your base salary? I think that's much more important. And that leads me on to the bonuses. What's the bonus geared to? It's not always possible to get this completely clear, but if it's a client-facing, revenue-generating role, which is what I went into as head of relationship management, then generally speaking, it will be target-driven. You've got to bring some revenue in to get your bonus. That's fair enough. That's what you're there for. If it's a support role, then say operations or marketing or whatever, then it's more probably going to be discretionary and geared to the overall trading performance of the firm. But I would caveat all that by saying there's a lot of variety within that. And I would also say that bonuses are always contingent at payment time because everybody thinks they are a special exception and what have you. But the point is, just what realistically do you think you can earn out of that? Don't necessarily be hamstrung by the like-for-like base salary. The key thing, as I was saying at the end, is, what I meant by that is it's much more important to get into a credible organization in a role that has great potential than to secure an initially high salary. If you're any good, and I'm sure you all are, then the rewards will follow soon enough once you prove yourself. So, as I say, don't price yourself.
I think that's a really good point because certainly I think if you've been used to working in the public sector, then obviously you're on pay scales, and certainly in the military you have to do so many years before you can be promoted and so on. And it's just really getting people to understand that actually if you go into a commercial organisation, you're paid on your performance, and therefore it's not a case of doing time served. It's a case of, are you delivering? Are you adding to the bottom line? Are you achieving your targets? Are you meeting the sales figures? That sort of thing. And that's going to be what determines the pay, or especially the bonus or the on-target earnings.
I think that's true. I think the only caveat I'll make to all that is, if you're there's no sort of promotion boards or nothing quite as formal as that in commercial life, although there are people with those sort of titles. So you might find, unless you're slightly pushier than you're used to be doing, that you'll be stuck in a certain role because you're doing a job which is valuable and it'll be hard to replace you. But you need to be a bit pushy. Once you've established your credentials, you've established you can do that job, you need to be looking for the next thing and not relying on some postings board in Glasgow to pick you up for it. There's definitely a need. I found this to, after a bit, think, unless I push this a bit, I'm just going to go stale here. And actually, it's pretty much an open door. People expect that, provided you're not going to do it prematurely, provided you prove you can deliver.
Yeah, no. And what about what you mentioned risk there? What did you mean by that?
Basically, I meant that there's. What I really meant was the company's taking a risk on you. If they're taking you from a completely uncommercial background as they see it into a different sector, then that is a risk. And we spend quite a lot of time talking to companies trying to mitigate that and pre-sell them on the virtues of hiring ex-military. But that's one of the factors why they may not be willing to take you on at exactly comparable salary to somebody else. They may well not do until you prove yourself. But that's what it is. I mean, as I say, don't price yourself out. You might have to take a bit of a risk premium drop to persuade them to take you. The other thing worth mentioning, although again it's slightly off the subject, I get a lot of people who say, I want to go into a revenue generating front office role. Well, fine, you're completely unproven in that respect. It's much easier to go into an operations type support role because there's military functions that relate to that. If you definitely want to go into those front office roles, then you've probably got to de-risk it for the employer and go in at a lower salary. And if you say, then you'll get a look because everybody wants to keep their bottom line to as low as it can. But I've seen people do that, and I've seen people demand too high a salary for a revenue generating role, which they just unproven, and they're just not going to get it.
Yeah. Okay. And you sort of covered bonuses already. I haven't mentioned like for like.
Yeah, I've done that. That's just the fact that you're public sector and private sector, and there's no bonus element or incentive element in the public sector salary. That's essentially what I meant.
But also, there are probably some of the differences in that possibly public sector, the pension scheme might be better than the one in the commercial world, depending on what you negotiate or what the company has to offer.
Yeah, so you're leading on this bullet point here, the military pension. Your military pension is your business. And if any employer says to you, oh, you're getting a military pension, therefore I'm only going to pay you, a lot less than the market rate for the job, then they're out of order. It's your business. So that's a red flag from any potential employer who makes those sort of noises. You need to consider, when you're doing your own financial estimate, what sort of income do I need? Then clearly that is a pertinent factor, your military pension, but it is not the business of an employer. And anybody who tries to say it is, I think is out of order, and you should not be accepting an offer for somebody like that.
I think that's really good, because I don't think you should be dealing with an employer who thinks like that you should be paid the market rate for the job. But as you say, the pension is your business and not somebody else.
It doesn't happen often, but there are a few companies I'm aware of who, they've had a few military people in before. They've learned that they, of a certain level, they've learned that they've had a pension, and they've tried to sort of, cut the offer accordingly, which I don't think is right.
Okay. And then bonuses you covered. I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to say about.
I've done this slide, actually. I mean, the key thing, as I said, much more important to getting a credible organisation than to be focused on salary. That don't think there's much more. I mean, it's such a wide span on this, but I think those are the bullet points in generic terms, which I would make to people.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I think you have to look at what is the bonus scheme, isn't it? Because as you say, some companies will pay on overall company performance, whereas others will pay, depending on what your role is, on individual performance.
Yeah, and some are entirely discretionary. So you're then at the whim of your director. So do I trust this guy? I mean, but generally those discretionary ones are geared to company performance. But you don't have much comeback if you sign a discretionary agreement, but a lot of arrangements are like that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they want to retain their workforce if they're any good, so they're not going to leg them over at that time. So there aren't too many horror stories about that.
Well, hopefully not. So then your final point was the key thing, much more important than salary.
No, I've already made that point. Just to get into a credible organisation, and that's much more important.
Yeah.
Than salary in your
And I've often heard people say who are in organisations, decide on the organisation that you want to work for, and the first role that you find in that organisation might not be the exact one you want, but you're in the organisation, and then you can sort of network and maybe go on a secondment to a different department or something like that to find the role that you want.
There's a lot of truth in that. There's also, I have to say that ex-military have a slight reputation for doing that, certainly in some.
Okay. So maybe that's not good advice then.
Well, I think you'll find, I'm thinking of one organisation where we've placed 16 in the last, when did we start with them? 2000, so last 4 years. And there's only 2 of those still in those original roles. And they are a bit skeptical. I mean, some of them are still in the organisation,
Yeah.
but they're a bit skeptical about the sticking power of, you know, they want people for the long term, and it's quite right that exponentials should network their way into the best roles they can, but it probably hasn't done some of the people coming along behind many favours. So you may get asked how long you're going to do this role, and you know, you can't give an explicit answer to that. But it's well known that quite a few people don't go into the right role for their first 2 years, then they will move when they've got a bit of commercial credibility, and some employers are aware of that, and it's a potential, you know, downside.
That's a really good point. Okay, thanks for that one then, Nick. Yeah, I remember that. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide. So, in fact, I've got a couple of questions coming up about salary negotiations, and I think that you're going to cover those now. But really, just it'd be useful for you to talk through sort of, you know, when, as you say, when does salary first rear its head, and then your advice.
I'm just going to talk through the basic process, and also, you know, and I accept there's a lot of variety around this. So it's not always true, but here goes. When does salary first rear its head? Rarely in a first interview. A first interview is this person going to fit in our organisation? That's not to say it's not going to happen. I mean, it does happen sometimes, but it's rare. So the second point, the etiquette point. What do I mean by that? There's an unwritten rule, which I think you need to understand, because not everybody has, and I've seen a few people trip up over this. If a role is advertised at, let's say, 65 to 70k, and you either apply for it direct, or you allow yourself to be put forward by a recruiter like us for that role, then you are tacitly accepting that you will, if an offer's made, that you will agree to that.
Yeah.
So if you then ask at the end of that process for 75k, then that is bad form. It's an unwritten rule. It's an important one. I've only seen it a couple of times, but I had a guy last year. He did exactly that. They said no. He said, well, in which case I'll accept the original offer. And they said, no, thanks. We don't like you anymore. So just be careful about that. The other point about that is, let's say the bracket is 65 to 70, as I said, in this role. They are most unlikely to offer you a role right at the top end of that bracket. And the reason for that is they want to allow headroom to promote you in your first year within that salary bracket without busting their salary structure. So it's unrealistic generally to if they're offering 65 to 70 to expect 70. They'll probably offer you 68, and they've got headroom to give you a bit of a rise. So again, that's something to appreciate. So I've known people ask for more against the etiquette rule, and sometimes they've succeeded, but I've known more people fail than succeed. So it's just worth you being aware of that.
I think that's really important point.
Yeah. Okay. The process thing, there's generally, again, this is as it usually happens, and it doesn't always unfold like this. Generally speaking, there'll be an initial, they'll ask you for an initial indication as to whether you'll accept an offer in principle. That'll sometimes happen verbally. As far as we're involved, generally, it normally happens via us after they've interviewed somebody. Can you find out if Joe Smith would accept an offer of 65k, whatever it may be, in principle? And we go back and say, broadly speaking, yes, subject to contract. Can you lay it out, please? So what then happens generally is an offer letter comes out, generally not more than a side and a half, and it outlines the main aspects of the package. It's completely non-contractual. It's informal. And then it's sent to your address. You look at it. If you've got a recruiter in play, you can ask them to look at it as well. That's the advice point, because we see a lot of these things. And employers quite often won't release them to us. Sometimes they do, but some of them are scared of data protection. This is a private document between us and that client, so they won't release it to us. And then generally you say, oh, I'm not quite happy about this, or it's quite acceptable to ask for clarification about the supporting aspects, whatever those may be. And what's involved, what I mean by that, salary, pension, bonus incentive scheme, share options, another topic in its own, medical cover, car allowance, holiday, probation period, all those things. If it's not clear, ask. I mean, that's what it's there for. It's an informal document for you to consider the offer with. They're not committed at that stage, neither are you. So, but what I would say is these things can lapse. There's generally sometimes that's formally stated at the letter. Normally it's about 10 days. They say this offer will lapse on the 14th of February unless you. Sometimes it's not stated, but they will do that anyway. So I would say when you do accept that, then you need to do that explicitly and verifiably. You're not committed until you sign a contract. That's the point I make, or neither are they. So the contract is, you don't need to get a lawyer involved. It's generally common sense. You might want to get a recruiter involved.
Yeah.
Is this normal? Or a friend involved. You can get a lawyer involved if you want to. That's up to you. The acceptance point, that's the point I've already made effectively. The reason this is difficult, and it's the bottom point, the competing offers, if you're doing your job hunting properly, you will find that it's a pretty unscientific process, and a lot of these things can come to the boil at roughly the same time, not necessarily in the sequence you want. And that can be pretty untidy. So sometimes you're sitting on an offer, you want to wait to see if the other one comes in, therefore you're not going to accept it straight away. That's difficult, and there's no way you can, juggle that. All I would say is, a bird in the hand sometimes is worth one in the bush, that's it. But that's the basic process, but there's a lot of movement and noise around that.
Yeah, I think that's really useful advice, because I say we've had some questions coming up about negotiation, which if we haven't covered them, I can ask at the end. But I think you have more or less covered that, so thank you very much for that. And then if we just go on to the final slide. Okay, sure. Which is about the questions. And I think you've given a pretty comprehensive overview there, Nick, and certainly you talked a bit about, if recruiters are involved or if people have to just negotiate for themselves. I have got a few questions. Are you happy I just then
Sure.
Do you? Well, here's somebody who's just asked a question. I have 7 years commercial experience prior to joining up. Can I expect that experience will be taken into consideration, or will I just be viewed as another military leaver?
No, you should. I mean, 7 years is a lengthy period of time. I mean, it depends what you were doing in context of the job you're applying for. Is it relevant to that? If it is, then surely you should be, that should be taken into account. And either you in your covering letter or your recruiter, if he's doing his job properly, in the sort of profile they put forward with your CV, should highlight that and the relevance of it. But I do stress that the relevance. If you're commercially experienced in a completely different sector at a completely different level of role, then that might not carry as much weight as something which is clearly of relevance to what you're applying for.
And I think also it depends on how long ago it is, because let's say if the experience was in the IT world or something like that, if then you've been in the military for 20 years, that 7 years commercial experience is probably going to be a bit out of date. Whereas if you've maybe had 7 years and you've only been in the military a few years, it might not be, it might be still fairly current.
Yeah, I think they're always going to ask in that context. So you were in commercial life for 7 years. What made you suddenly throw it up and go and join the military? And what have you now? So all these questions are going to come up. But I think it should be relevant. Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple of other questions that have come up. So I've got somebody here, and you did touch on it. You talked about salary range. When a job advert has a salary range, how should you handle the negotiations?
Well, I've sort of alluded to this. I think, there's always a negotiation, and they will probably go a bit. It's a bit like buying a second-hand car, to be honest. I mean, they will probably go a bit lower than you want. You don't want to price yourself out the market. So, as I say, don't ask for 70k when it's offering 65 to 70k. But you could ask for a bit more. But I think you need to, you generally need to leave your, is there any chance of a slight increase on that because for whatever reason, rather than I need at least. You want to leave yourself a line of retreat, and you don't want to be dogmatic about it. But again, if you're going via a recruiter, then take their advice. Bear in mind, though, I'm sort of slagging off my own trade here. Not that all recruiters are remunerated on fee, so it's in our interests to get you into that role at the highest rate we can, and we'll try and do that, not only for your sake, for our sake. But if we say, look, I don't think they'll wear that, then I will wear that advice, because we'll do the best we can. I've been proved wrong before. I've had a few people who've said, well, I'm going to demand this, and bless them, they've got it, but not many.
Yeah. No, I think that's good advice there. Sorry, there was something else that just came up. Yes, you touched on this one. Somebody's asking the question here: if you have an offer from one company, but you're waiting for an offer from the second, would it be prudent to ask the second if they're going to make an offer?
Well, you could. I mean, all circumstances are different. You could. I mean, I've certainly chivied companies along before, saying, look, Joe Smate is sitting on offer from another company. He's very interested in what you may offer, but you're going to have to move quickly. So if you have a third party involved in the mix, like a recruiter, I would leave that rather dirty, grubby sort of stuff to them, and keep your own hands clean. But if you're applying direct, then you have no options. I think it's reasonable to say, look, I do have another offer. I'm going to have to reply in the next week or so. I would very much like to work for your company, but you basically get on with it. You might have to put it a bit more tactfully, but so I think I think it's perfectly reasonable. Provided you're tactful about it.
Yes, I think that's right. We've got time maybe for 2 or 3 more questions. So here's one: would you expect a market rate? Salary if moving into an industry in a sector directly related to your military experience?
Yeah, I think you would. If your experience is directly related to whatever that is, so let's say it's probably the defence sector or conceivably the security sector, then probably yes, that would be fair. I don't say you should be under the rate in other sectors, but don't price yourself out of the market by trying to equate base salary to the base salary. It's what you end up with at the end of the year in your tax return.
I talk to clients about this, that you could be moving into an industry where you have direct experience, like telco or defence or something like that, but you've still got the element where you haven't necessarily worked in the commercial world, and therefore you may not be able to move direct like for like, depending on what the role is.
I think that's true, and that may be a fear of the company, but to be honest, the commerciality bit, it is not rocket science. It really isn't. I did it. You've got to make a profit. That's it. And what it generally means, so I was an operations director at one stage. If you're an operations officer in the military, you're trying to do things to the best of your ability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're an operations director in commercial life, you've got to make a margin. You've got to make a profit. So it generally beating up your suppliers, working out how we can do things better, smoother, smarter, deliver a good product to our clients, not necessarily a Rolls Royce, one that will satisfy the terms of the contract, but so all those factors, which are slightly different to the military mindset, are going through your mind, and that's all commerciality is, really.
No, that's a really good point. A question here: you mentioned salary ranges, but somebody's come up with the question: how do you deal with a job where there is no salary range? You see the advert, and quite often it might say, a salary competitive or something like that.
It often does say that. So, and I think it's a bit of a cop out by the recruiter. I mean, a couple of bits of advice about that. Quite often, if they advertise this, it sometimes says, if you want to speak to our retained consultant about this, it gives you a phone number and probably a name. If you see that, my view is always find a reason to call anyway, even if you haven't got a question, because they're probably inundated in applications, and if they have a sensible conversation with somebody, then they'll pull your CV out of the pile. I've fallen for it myself. Yeah. But also in that conversation, you can say, look, what is comparable? And they'll probably say, well, what are you earning now? And you'll say whatever, and they'll say, well, that is competitive, or they'll say something. So there's a bit of smoke and mirrors around that. But I agree, you can waste a lot of time applying for something that's either miles out of your range or well below you. And there's no, black and white solid answer to that.
Okay, I think that's a good point. I'm just going to I'm going to ask two more questions, but what I will say to everybody listening, because there are some more questions coming in, but we're just going to run out of time, is that if anybody has got any more questions, well, Nick has very kindly put his email address up there, but also I'm happy to take questions if you email me, Fiona Jackson, and then I can pass them on to Nick. Just the final two questions, Nick. There's one about military talent programs. So many companies now have military talent programs run by ex-military individuals. Is there any evidence to show that they actively offer under the rate, knowing what you've come from, given your rank and length of service?
No, I don't think I've got any empirical evidence to that effect. I mean, what it has meant for us, certainly, is some of these companies who used to come to people like us, rather annoyingly, once they've got 5 or 6 people in, they start up a military program. And that's fine. I mean, that's just commerciality. Yeah. I think some of these are well established. And I think they're, it's well worth you going on them if you get the chance, because even if you don't get a job out of it, you'll get a lot of the lexicon, the vocabulary, a lot of understanding of that sector, and it's something else to put in your CV. Some of them are not so well established. That 1 or 2 of them have failed. But it depends. Most of the banks now have got programs like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Certainly from my experience, and having talking to some of the financial institutions recently, they have well-established military programs. They tend to be aiming at your sort of senior captain level, so therefore their starting point salary is similar to what a senior captain will be earning, and there isn't much differentiation between the companies. But then, obviously, once you progress within that company, there is the opportunity to earn much more.
Yeah, they're branded rather differently. Some of them are explicitly military recruitment programs. Some of them are much more dressed up as corporate social responsibility, and we'll talk about city and we'll do the right thing by the military covenant, and this is the vocabulary and this is the language. But they're not fools either. If they like the look of somebody, they will make an offer.
Yeah, okay. So final question here, Nick. I have an offer that is much lower than I'm currently earning, but I see as reasonable as I'm not yet chartered. I expect to be chartered in the next 1 to 2 years with the experience this job will provide. At this point, I feel I would be underpaid. Should I ask the potential employer about this?
It's a difficult circumstance. If you like the look of the employer and you would like to work there, then I think it is worth progressing that conversation. I think it is worth saying, could I have a review in a certain number of months? And I've negotiated that for people for a review after 6 months, a review after 4 months. Or when I qualify or I get this particular exam, whatever it is, could we then have a salary review? And sometimes that's contractual. Sometimes it's on a gentleman's handshake. But I think there needs to be some understanding that you don't want to be locked into a job where you've been underpaid forever. Just because of what you took initially. So there needs to be some, signposted route out of that. And I think that's a fair question. If they know they're getting you an under the market rate and you will be qualified at a certain stage, then I think it's fair to say, look, at that stage, can we have a review?
Yeah, okay. Well, Nick, thank you very much. I mean, your advice and wisdom has been absolutely fantastic, and I hope that all of the people listening have appreciated it. As I say, if we haven't answered any of your questions, then please feel free to contact Nick, or say contact me, Fiona Jackson, at the Officers Association. And thanks very much for your time tonight. And thank you, Nick, for also giving up your time to come and talk to everybody.
No, well, I enjoyed it. As always, want to pass on the wisdom. If anybody's got is coming on the market and hasn't registered with us, by all means do say. That doesn't mean we'll get you a job, or much more in the sort of of getting, filling finding people for jobs rather than jobs for people. But you're very welcome to send it across. If you're not in the hat, we don't know about you. You're not going to get the jackpot. So anyway, questions are welcome, and you have my email there.
Okay, thanks very much then, Nick. Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody.